1942, May 27th. A sharp right-hand curve in Libeň. An open-topped Mercedes slows because it has to. A blast. Then 8 days of tightening rope. Hospital, files, reprisals. This is about mechanics, how power keeps notes, and how a small change on a security sheet can turn into a body count. Elena Volkova walked across Old Town Square with a ration card folded in her pocket. The card was her legal right to a little food, and it was also a record that proved she was still present in a city that preferred she wasn't. The result was that her survival depended on ink and punches, not kindness. The cost was that every hole in that paper could be used later to count her out. She was a widow, but not the kind people pitied. Her husband had vanished into the administrative fog that came with occupation. Work details, questioning, rumors, then silence. She had no grave to kneel at, and no official letter to hold up in defense. The result was that the neighborhood filled the empty space with its own story. The cost was that a story, once shared, became more real than any fact she could produce. At the ration window, the clerk punched her card without looking at her face. Metal bit paper, and the hand moved on as if Elena were already processed. Elena turned away and felt the stares settle on her like weight. In this city, people stared to build a case. Someone spat. Someone said the word the city liked best: collaborator. The result was simple moral math. If she had bread, she must have traded something. If she wasn't in a cell, she must have made herself useful. The cost was that she couldn't argue with a crowd that wanted certainty more than truth. Hands started to close in, not yet fists, but the kind of hands that test fabric and look for seams to tear. Elena kept moving because stopping would make the next step inevitable. The result was a narrow, moving pocket of danger around her. The cost was that she had to accept she might not reach her own door today. Boots struck stone with a different rhythm, sharper and more confident, and the crowd shifted the way water shifts when a heavier object enters it. Captain Hans Richter arrived with 2 soldiers at his shoulder, Wehrmacht grey, clean and deliberate. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The result was that the crowd hesitated, calculating consequences. The cost was immediate. Everyone saw him intervene on Elena's side. Hans pointed, ordered the ring to open, and cited the occupation's public order rules as if he were reciting something he had memorized for this exact purpose. The soldiers moved people back with their bodies, not their rifles. The result was space around Elena again, a narrow lane of safety. The cost was that her protection happened in public, where it would be repeated and embellished. Elena did not thank him, because thanks is an invitation, and invitations are traps when power is nearby. She simply walked as if she had done nothing wrong and expected the street to behave. The result was a posture that kept her from looking like prey. The cost was that it made her look to some eyes like someone who expected privileges. Hans followed her to the edge of the square and produced a small parcel wrapped in newspaper, flour maybe, and fat, the kind of thing that didn't come from ration lines. He held it out without touching her. The result was an offer that could be read as kindness. The cost was the ledger behind it, invisible but real. Elena stared at the parcel with calculation. If she took it, the neighborhood would say they were right. If she refused, she might not eat. The result was a choice between being hated and being hungry. The cost was that either option strengthened someone else's control over her. She refused with silence and a small turn of her wrist, as if dismissing a nuisance rather than a meal. Hans didn't insist. He only watched her longer than he needed to, and that extra second carried a message. He would be back. The result was that Elena had not taken the food, but she had been noticed. The cost was attention, which in an occupied city was expensive. On the stairs to her building, she passed her neighbor Jana, a woman who used to borrow sugar before sugar became a myth. Jana looked at Elena's face, then looked away as if Elena were something the building wished to deny. The result was social exile enforced by ordinary people. The cost was that Elena understood she would not be saved by her own community if the authorities came. That night, Elena counted what she had left. A few coupons, some coins, and her hands. Her hands could play Bach, could accompany a singer, could teach children who were no longer allowed to be children. Her hands could also make her useful to men who wanted culture as a trophy. The result was a cold inventory of her resources. The cost was admitting that dignity was not on the list. She went to church not because she believed the church could defeat an empire, but because churches still had corners where people whispered. Father André met her after the main candles were out, when the shadows were thick enough to hide faces. The result was a chance to hear something that wasn't street gossip. The cost was that any contact with a priest in 1942 could be watched, recorded, and twisted. In the confessional, André didn't ask about sins. He asked whether Elena wanted to live. He spoke about a need inside the highest offices, music in a household connected to the Prague castle district, the kind of household where culture was displayed like a medal. He didn't name the man, but he didn't have to. The result was a doorway disguised as employment. The cost was that walking through it meant entering a place where rules were made, not followed. Elena understood what André was really offering. Not safety, but proximity. Proximity could become leverage, or it could become a grave. She wanted to refuse on principle, but principle didn't stop hunger or denunciation. The result was that she agreed with a nod that felt like surrender. The cost was that she would have to become careful in new ways, inside corridors where one wrong breath could end her. André gave her only what she could carry without paper: times, a procedure, and a warning that names were poison. He told her where to go, what to say, and when to shut her mouth. The result was a plan built for survival, not heroism. The cost was that Elena had to accept being used as a tool by people who would never put their own bodies in front of hers. The next day, a clerk wrote Elena's name into a ledger and stamped a temporary pass. The stamp sounded like a gavel in a room that pretended it wasn't a courtroom. The result was an official excuse to move through gates. The cost was that her movement was now documented, and documentation could be turned into accusation with a single decision. Hans met her at the outer checkpoint, not by accident. He was now assigned to coordinate external security, where Wehrmacht routines brushed against SS authority. An SS adjutant inspected Elena's pass, as if ink were suspicious by nature. Hans stood nearby, stiff, watching the adjutant's eyes the way a man watches a dog's teeth. The result was Elena entering with permission and contempt at the same time. The cost was Hans learning in front of her that his rank was only tolerated here. Inside, the building swallowed sound. Old stone and polished floors made footsteps echo farther than they should, as if the place wanted to announce everyone who moved through it. Elena followed a servant down a corridor and kept her face blank. The result was that she looked like someone who belonged to the furniture, which was safer than looking like a person. The cost was the feeling of being reduced. Elena was told to play. She did, because refusal is loud, and she could not afford loud. Someone listened from behind a door, and the listening was not about artistry. It was about compliance. The result was a successful audition in the only way that mattered. The cost was knowing she had been assessed the way one assesses a lock or a knife. Later, in a hallway, Elena saw Reinhard Heydrich pass close enough for her to smell the crispness of his uniform and the confidence of his stride. He carried himself like a man who believed the world was a machine he could tune. People around him adjusted their posture without thinking, because fear trains reflexes. The result was Elena's small life crossing the path of a man big enough to bend the city. The cost was the involuntary shrinking inside her chest. Heydrich paused and looked at her hands. He asked, casually, what her husband had been. It was the kind of question that sounded personal, but functioned as a file note. Elena answered, in the fewest words she could. The result was that she did not give him material for curiosity. The cost was that he smiled anyway, as if he enjoyed extracting obedience. At the far end of the corridor, Elena saw Hans watching. His face held something like protectiveness, but it was mixed with pride and resentment, ingredients that didn't make safety. The result was Elena realizing Hans could be moved because he had feelings he couldn't afford. The cost was that using him would mean accepting what came after. Heydrich summoned Elena when he wanted the household to feel civilized. He preferred Bach because Bach sounded like order, and order was his favorite performance. Elena played precisely because precision reduced the chance of punishment. The result was that she became useful and therefore temporarily protected. The cost was that usefulness put her on a schedule that belonged to someone else. Heydrich didn't treat music as comfort. He treated it as a lever. He would request a piece, then interrupt and demand a different tempo, not because he cared, but because he wanted to see whether Elena would adjust without protest. Elena adjusted every time, turning obedience into muscle memory. The result was survival through controlled submission. The cost was the slow corrosion of her self-respect. Hans remained a constant at thresholds. SS men spoke to him with a particular kind of politeness that carried contempt, reminding him that the real power in the protectorate did not wear Wehrmacht grey. When instructions were given, Hans was made to repeat them back like a schoolboy. The result was daily humiliation masked as procedure. The cost was pride being scraped down to raw bone. Elena learned routines the way a trapped person learns the hours of a guard. She watched which corridors cleared at which times, which doors were locked, which servants were trusted, and which ones listened too closely. The result was a private map in her head. The cost was that knowing the map made her responsible for what could be done with it. One evening, rain hit the windows hard enough to sound like thrown gravel. Heydrich ordered Hans to stand on the terrace in an alert posture. The excuse was security. The real point was cruelty. From that terrace, Hans could see through a narrow gap in a curtain into the room where Elena played. The result was that Heydrich forced Hans to witness what he could not prevent. The cost was grievance turning from vague resentment into sharp hatred. Elena played the arranged air cleanly at first, then let a note slip slightly out of place, a controlled mistake that could be explained by nerves. Heydrich corrected her with a voice that sounded bored, then ordered her to continue as if she were a machine that had been recalibrated. The result was that he increased pressure while maintaining the appearance of refinement. The cost was Elena's boundaries being treated as irrelevant. When the piece ended, Elena stood, gathered her sheets, and walked out without running. Running would have declared weakness, and weakness invited pursuit. At the terrace door, she let her sleeve fall just enough to show bruising on her wrist, marks made by a grip held too long. She did not look at Hans while doing it. The result was a visible fact planted in his mind. The cost was Elena using her own pain as currency. Hans stared at the bruises, and then at Heydrich's curtain, and Elena watched his jaw tighten. He did not speak, because SS ears turned speech into evidence. The result was silence that contained a decision forming. The cost was that Elena had lit something she might not be able to extinguish. Heydrich escalated his game in public. He hosted a gathering where branches mixed on purpose, men in black, men in grey, all forced to pretend they were one team. Heydrich singled out Hans with a joke about old soldiers and asked whether the army still taught men how to obey. Laughter in that room was a form of voting. The result was Hans being humiliated in front of witnesses who mattered. The cost was his dignity being damaged in a way that demanded repair. Heydrich then made Hans repeat an order word for word, corrected him on a trivial phrase, and framed it as discipline and honor. The words sounded noble. The act was degradation. Hans complied because defiance inside an SS-controlled house was not bravery. It was suicide. The result was obedience turning into bitterness. The cost was Hans needing a way to feel like a man again. Elena sat at the piano through this because music was her assigned mask. She watched who laughed too quickly and who avoided eye contact. She saw the SS adjutant, Kurt, watching everyone the way a clerk watches for mistakes on a form. The result was Elena understanding that the household was a surveillance system disguised as culture. The cost was that every move she made had to be designed for plausible deniability. Father Andrei found Elena in a corridor later, in the thin slice of time when servants changed shifts and attention dipped. He spoke in logistics, not drama. He told her the resistance had men in Prague trained and inserted months earlier, and they were waiting for confirmation of a route. He also mentioned a practical problem. The Sten gun was simple and portable, but it could jam, which meant the plan needed a location where a jam would not end everything. The result was Elena hearing the real reason she had been brought inside. She was the last missing detail. The cost was accepting that the detail would lead to bodies. Elena didn't ask about names. Names were liabilities. She asked only what kind of information was needed: time, route, protection pattern. Andrei said route, and he said it like a man asking for a wrench, because to him it was a tool. The result was clarity about her task. The cost was realizing there would be no clean hands at the end. Heydrich traveled with the confidence of someone who believed the city was already broken. He often used an open-topped car as a show of dominance, and routine was part of that show. Elena learned the routine indirectly. When corridors cleared, when guards tightened, when the household shifted into departure posture. The result was that she could predict movement without ever seeing a schedule. The cost was that prediction made her complicit. In a service hallway, Elena overheard guards complain about traffic and trams on the road north of the city centre, about a bend in Libeň where the driver always had to slow down. The guards treated it as annoyance. Elena heard it as geometry. The result was a mundane detail turning into a target. The cost was that Elena felt the first real nausea of what she was doing. Hans began to change. Elena saw him at night with a cigarette, his hand shaking slightly, not from fear of bullets, but from the strain of swallowing humiliation. He did not approach her like a flirt anymore. He approached her like a man standing near a cliff, looking for a reason to step back or forward. The result was Elena gaining access to a new kind of weakness in him. The cost was that weakness could snap into violence. Hans spoke in fragments, careful ones. He mentioned inspection lists. He mentioned how SS men engineered blame. They created impossible standards, then punished failure to prove authority. He said quietly that if anything happened to the protector, the army would be blamed first because blame was a weapon the SS understood. The result was Elena learning Hans feared disgrace more than death. The cost was knowing exactly how to push him. Elena sat at the piano alone one night and found blank paper tucked inside her sheet music, Andrei's promised channel. She stared at it as if it were already stained. The result was a prepared hiding place disguised as culture. The cost was that discovery would turn the piano into evidence if it was ever searched. Hans appeared in the doorway and asked what Heydrich wanted tomorrow. The question wasn't curiosity. It was a man testing whether the next day still had any meaning. Elena answered with a lie shaped like truth. She said the travel would be as usual toward the castle district, and she said the household intended to move her afterward, to remove her from Heydrich's orbit. The result was a deadline being placed inside Hans's head. The cost was Elena becoming the clock he would act on. She added one more sentence, not emotional, just factual in tone. She said a man who humiliates an officer in public doesn't stop there, and the next humiliation would be written into Hans's file like a permanent stain. The result was Hans's grievance locking onto Heydrich as its only acceptable target. The cost was pushing Hans past the point where hesitation could preserve his dignity. Hans went to his paperwork like a man going to confession. On the security allocation for May 27th, he made a reasonable adjustment, reduced side motorcycle coverage near the narrow streets and the bend, cited traffic and efficiency. He wrote betrayal in bureaucratic language. The result was protection thinned where slowing was unavoidable. The cost was his signature becoming a future noose. He copied the route confirmation by hand and folded it small. When he placed it into Elena's sheet music, he did it with the careful precision of someone handling contraband, because that's what it was. Elena waited until he was gone, then opened the fold and read the names and the direction. Through Libeň, along the stretch that met the sharp curve near the junction that forced braking. The result was certainty shaped like a street corner. The cost was the sick certainty that someone would die on that corner because of this paper. Elena carried the sheet music to church under the cover of habit. habit kept you alive in places where patterns were watched. She sat long enough to be seen, then left the music in a dusty niche where hands could reach without drawing attention. The result was the root leaving her possession without a spoken word. The cost was that she could no longer pull it back, even if her courage failed. On the walk home, Elena noticed the city felt tighter, as if it sensed something in the air. More boots, more glances, more sudden stops and checks. The result was a feeling of a net being drawn. The cost was Elena knowing she was standing inside it and could not tell whether it was meant for her. Elena went to the Bend on May the 27th because she needed proof that her life had not become meaningless suffering. If she was going to be destroyed anyway, she wanted to know the chain had snapped someone bigger first. She chose a higher spot where she could see without being obvious, collar up, face angled away from the street. The result was a vantage point that offered confirmation. The cost was the risk of being remembered by the wrong eyes. The morning sounded ordinary. Trams, engines, distant voices. Then the traffic thinned, and the open-topped Mercedes appeared, unarmored, moving with the relaxed arrogance of a regime that believed Prague belonged to it. Elena saw the driver, Johannes Klein, and the upright posture beside him that could only be Heydrich. The result was her private manipulation lining up with public history. The cost was the final collapse of denial. At the sharp right-hand curve, the driver slowed because physics does not negotiate. A figure stepped forward and raised a weapon. Elena heard a mechanical cough that should have been gunfire. It failed. The sten jammed. The result was a split second where the plan wobbled. The cost was that failure in that moment could have meant capture, torture, and a longer reign of terror. Heydrich reacted the way arrogance often does. He ordered the car to stop and began to stand, drawing his own weapon as if dominance could solve geometry. The result was Heydrich choosing confrontation over escape. The cost was that his choice created space for contingency. Another figure moved and hurled a grenade, modified for the job. It detonated beside the car with a flat crack that slapped echoes off stone and metal. Smoke rose. The car lurched. Bodies scattered. The result was Heydrich wounded and the Mercedes damaged, in a way photographs would later make iconic. The cost was that the blast opened the city to a broader violence that no one on that street could control. Elena did not run because running would turn her into a suspect. She watched the attackers disappear into the city's seams, watched Heydrich stagger, watched guards hesitate because no one had trained them for their master being mortal. The result was Elena collecting fragments of fact that would protect her later. The cost was those fragments lodging in her mind like shrapnel. Sirens spread across Prague, and the sound made the city feel like a locked room. Checkpoints multiplied. Posters appeared promising rewards for information and punishment for silence. The result was a manhunt that turned neighbors into informants and informants into currency. The cost was Elena's isolation turning lethal, because isolation meant no one would lie for her. Inside the castle district, the household changed its rhythm. Music was called for less. Meetings replaced dinners. Guards tightened. Elena's usefulness dropped at the very moment the danger rose. The result was her losing the thin shield of being needed. The cost was exposure. Elena saw Hans once after the attack, between two men in black uniforms, his hands held behind him, not in cuffs she could see, but in a posture that meant he already belonged to someone else. He did not look toward her, because looking could be interpreted. The result was Elena's lever becoming an object moved by stronger hands. The cost was the realization that she could no longer protect him, even if she wanted to. News reached her in pieces, as it does in occupied cities. Heydrich was taken to Bulovka Hospital. Surgeons worked. Infection threatened. People whispered medical words as if they were curses. The result was a slow unfolding of consequence over days instead of seconds. The cost was Prague living under suspended sentence, waiting to see whether the regime's anger would be wounded or enraged. On June the 4th, the announcement arrived that Heydrich had died early that morning. The city absorbed it like a blow, because everyone understood what followed. The result was the removal of one man and the multiplication of his shadow, because the machinery he commanded did not die with him. The cost was that civilians became currency used to prove control. Reprisals tightened into routine. Executions, raids, files closed with gunshots. Elena heard one name repeated in a way that sounded like warning: Lidice. She learned through whispers and a posted notice that the village had been destroyed, men shot, women and children deported. The result was terror translated into policy. The cost was Elena understanding that the chain she helped move had snapped down on people who had never seen her face. Another name followed: Ležáky, destroyed after connections to resistance networks were found. The pattern was clear. The regime used villages as examples because examples travel faster than explanations. The result was fear spreading outward like a stain. The cost was Elena feeling her own role harden into something she could not explain away. Elena tried to find Father Andrei because she wanted to know whether she had been used and discarded, or whether there was still a plan that included her survival. The church felt watched. A different priest stood near the side door. Andrei's name was not spoken. The result was Elena realizing that networks survive by cutting loose anything that might compromise them. The cost was abandonment at the exact moment she needed shelter. She was called in for questioning, politely, like an appointment. In a small room, an officer asked about her pass, her movements on May 27th, and her connection to Hans. Elena offered simple truths: practice hours, errands, church visits that sounded boring and therefore safe. She did not offer the one truth that mattered. The result was a temporary release because the machine needed its case built carefully. The cost was knowing the file remained open. Days later, under the pretense of an employment update, Elena was taken to a cell block where she saw Hans behind bars. He looked thinner, and the posture of his shoulders said he had learned what it meant to be powerless under the SS. He watched Elena as if he needed her eyes to tell him he had done something meaningful. The result was a final connection formed without a word. The cost was Hans misunderstanding her silence as forgiveness, because men in despair will accept any sign as absolution. Elena met his gaze and gave him nothing warm. Warmth would have been a lie, and lies were what had brought them here. The result was that she kept her last remaining control. She did not rewrite her own story to comfort him. The cost was carrying the weight alone, because isolation was the price of clarity. After that, Elena did what survivors do when paperwork turns into hunting. She sold her piano, because the piano was no longer an instrument. It was a hiding place, a record, a reason to search her home. She acquired forged papers and changed the version of her name that the city used. The result was disappearance, the only protection left. The cost was surrendering the one thing she had owned that was purely hers: the sound under her fingers. She crossed the Vltava in morning fog, keeping her head down, moving with the steady pace of someone who belonged. She did not tell anyone where she was going, because telling creates a trail, and trails lead to doors kicked in at night. The result was a life that continued somewhere else, thin and cautious. The cost was that she carried Prague with her anyway, because memory needs no passport. People would remember the curve in Libeň and the dead man in the Mercedes. They would argue about courage and consequences, about whether the price was worth it. The city would build memorials and change street signs and teach the event as history. The result was a clean narrative centered on famous men. The cost was the woman who nudged the system disappearing into rumor, a pianist with a dead face, a figure seen at a distance, a name lost among punched cards and closed files. War kept going. Prague kept breathing. But for Elena, the music had ended the moment the route left her sheet music and became a line on a street. The result was a life saved in the narrow sense. The cost was a self that had been burned out to keep the body moving.